to my live chat. You might have noticed that I'm doing it a little earlier today because my show on Nat Geo TV is on at 9 o'clock in Canada today. So I didn't want to be my own competition for the show. So I figured I'd do the live chat early, and then if you're not completely sick of me, you can jump over and watch Nat Geo, watch our show Home in the Wild on Nat Geo TV in Canada. Anyways, there's so many things I want to talk about. This is kind of my last scheduled live chat for the time being. I think I'm going to jump into doing more for sure though. Yeah, and there's a lot I wanted to talk about. I don't know how much we're going to get, we're going to manage to get to it all completely. But first of all, I just want to crack a Tread Lightly by Muskoka Brewery here. Delicious light lager, tastes like it's not a light beer, but it is a light beer. And pretty cool can too. It's a good sized can. 568 milliliters. Good to take camping, all the above. Anyways, yeah, so we are going to be talking about wilderness canoeing, outdoor survival, and more specifically, remote trip planning, choosing the right gear. I get asked a lot of questions about gear, and I'm going to tell some unforgettable paddling tales as well. And I'm going to try to do more Q&A sessions. I've been doing kind of Q&A sessions at the end, but I'm going to do a couple Q&A sessions throughout each topic as well. Tori, we can all thank Tori, my awesome, amazing wife, owner of Paddle Like a Girl. Check out at Tori Goes Outside on Instagram. She's going to be fielding some questions, and they're going to be popping up on a screen I have right here, like highlighted. So if you see me like looking over here awkwardly, that's why I'm looking at the iPad screen. But anyways, yeah, outdoor survival and wilderness canoeing. So one of the things I thought before I went on the survival show alone, which is on right now, by the way, I think they're in northern Saskatchewan this time, but I'm not sure. But anyways, one of the things is why was I a survivalist, right? Like, well, I do mostly canoe trips, obviously some backpacking, winter trekking, and stuff like that. But when they asked me to be on alone, I kind of thought, well, do I really have that kind of skill? You know what I mean? Like a old school survivalist that can nap arrowheads, that's lighting bow drill fires, that's always sleeping in shelters, right? I'm more, taking gear with me, good gear. Is important, and so I wasn't really sure. Well, it really turned out that at the end of the day, those skills, although important, it's really the skill of just kind of being able to tough it out that is the ultimate survival skill. As long as you can keep yourself from freezing, get a fire going, and keep yourself with a reasonable amount of food and water, being able to just deal with things makes a big difference. And when you're on wilderness canoe trips, that's what you do, and that's the one skill that you can't really learn from a book or from a YouTube channel, a YouTube video. It's only learned through experience. And when you're on a remote canoe trip, there's no going home when it gets raining out, and it doesn't matter if we have all the fanciest gear in the world nowadays. You got your GPSs, you got materials. I'm using a canoe that much in the same style as been used for thousands of years, but it's made out of modern materials, right? And but at the end of the day, you still have to know how to rig a tight, warm camp when it's cold out. You still have to know how to fend off hypothermia, how to keep all your stuff dry, how to light a fire when it's pouring rain, how to just push on through when the bugs are attacking you and when the portage is tough, and how to navigate and how to think positive when things go wrong, when stuff breaks, how to improvise. And these are all kind of the core bases of survival. I remember it was Kai and Dave Maroney from Lure of the North. I was having this conversation with. Kai was on a season of Alone too, and they said that canoe tripping and winter travel and traditional style winter camping too is like bushcraft in motion. So when you do that, you like, I guess a good way to put it is survival. It isn't really fun. So the more things that you've done out there that aren't fun, to the point where you stop caring and you start having fun anyways, even though most people aren't having fun anymore. That's how you know you're getting what is likely the best survival skill of just being able to tough it out more or less. And when you're out there in remote areas on a wilderness trip, you can't go back inside. And I think what happens when it comes to survival, and if you want to get better at survival, I think the key is that you have to kind of go beyond practicing survival skills, and you have to put yourself in situations where you pretty much need to use those survival skills, but obviously safe, with safety in mind. Don't go do something crazy because you can die. Like if you're in a super remote area and you don't bring matches and you're cold and you dump your canoe and you're a couple hundred meters from shore, good luck getting a bow drill fire going before you die of hypothermia, right? So you got to be safe. But I think what happens is that practicing survival skills is fun, like getting a bow drill fire and learning to forage. And everybody wants to try lighting a bow drill fire. And if it's a warm day and you have time to select the right pieces that you need to do that, that can be a lot of fun. But when you're lost, when you're hypothermic, when you're terrified, when your mind's racing, when you're panicked, at the end of the day, and you're exhausted, and you have to get this bow drill fire going to potentially save your life, that is anything but fun. And I think, as we get better and better as outdoors people, we start to be able to endure more and more hardships, but not really look at them as hardships anymore. And it's great to practice a bow drill fire, but if you're car camping and it starts to rain, and you just bust out the gasoline and light a bonfire that way, or just sleep in your car, or you have an easy out, then you're not really learning that deeper skill. And no matter what happens out there, if you're on, let's say, a show like Alone, and you have that tap out button, you might be able to get that bow drill fire going, but you're going to be scared because you're going to be cold and you're not going to understand how to deal with some discomforts, or you just don't want to because those discomforts are more magnified for you than they would be if you're somebody that's done extensive backcountry trips and has this experience when they're forced to light a fire, and when people are hypothermic and they know they can do it and they're not so concerned about it anymore. Those are the people that tend to do best in survival situations and tend to win alone, are the people that just have real bush time. That doesn't mean that there's not something to be learned from every which person. And also on the show Alone specifically, some just fluke things happen to people that got injured that could have happened to anybody. So you can't judge what you see on TV by any means, but I think as a core rule, that's there's something to be said for that. One of the things I noticed, if you've seen on my YouTube channel, I have some Arctic expedition films up there. And, it's really important, they say in a survival situation, they say shelter, fire, water, food. Sometimes people argue whether sometimes fire should come before shelter. And I'm sure there could be a good argument for that. And sometimes when you're on a beautiful summer day and the weather's warm, you might not have to worry about that so strictly. But what I notice on my Arctic trips is that situations I've been in get pretty freaking scary. When blizzards blow up, when the temperature is minus 40 degrees, when it's just whiteout conditions, where there's nowhere to find shelter, you can't set up your tent because of howling winds. Freezing to death is a real strong potential. However, that's when knowing what to do is really important. There are ways that you can deal with it. I dealt with some crazy windstorms in the Arctic. And I remember one on Baffin Island. I just climbed up to the height of land in Akshaya Pass, and I unfortunately worked up too much of a sweat climbing up that hill. And as I got to the top, some of the strongest wind I've ever experienced in my life blew up. And it was gusting. I could barely even walk into it. It was just insane. To call it insane is an understatement. We're talking probably about 100-mile-an-hour winds, 170-kilometer-an-hour winds. Any snow that was blowing was stinging my face. I couldn't see. I was cold, and at that area, at that time, the snow wasn't hard packed. So, how do you? I couldn't go on for much longer before freezing, and eventually, if I did stop, this blizzard was ended up going on for hours and hours and hours. I wouldn't be able to get my tent up for shelter, and the snow was either too low and there was no snow, or it wasn't hard packed snow. And the reason you need hard packed snow is so you could build a snow block wall, a super sturdy snow block wall to block the wind and able to set your tent up. So that way you can set your tent up behind the snow block wall. And I was looking around, and I didn't see any of this, and the cold was just cutting through my parka, and I started getting scared. And I reminded myself, there's always something. Nature always gives you something. And if you can just keep a level head, I think that, and think rationally, you can often find something that is a lot more obvious than you thought it was. And that is, again, when it comes to wilderness survival, and as people that are, remote canoe trippers that do wilderness canoeing, stuff like that, these are all kind of plan B things. We learn wilderness survival not to go out and do, survival camping trips where we practice them in a controlled environment where we're not really an emergency. We learn these things because if something goes wrong, we lose our canoe in a rapid, it smashes, all our gear's disappeared, we somehow lost or broke our communication equipment, we're in the middle of nowhere, all of a sudden stuff gets really real really quick and you are in a survival situation. So this is why we learn these things for sure, and that's why they're important to learn, but they're not something that, as a wilderness canoeist or as a typical backcountry winter camper, you're going to head out there planning on practicing at the time. Anyways, what they say when it comes to shelter, fire, water, food. If anyone's not familiar with those, when you find yourself in a survival situation, those are the four things you got to do in that order. First, you find shelter, then you find fire, then you find water, then you find food. And if you stick to those things, you have a much better chance than if you say you try to find food first. So very, very, very important. But before that, before they talk about, the four things, shelter, fire, water, food, before they talk about those things, they say first thing, stay calm. And this is the survival instructors. This is the survival books. They say, okay, first you got to stay calm. Then, you worry about shelter. But staying calm is grossly overlooked, in my opinion, in the survival literature and the survival schools and all that kind of stuff. Say, okay, first stay calm. Then we're going to do this. And they spend all this time teaching shelters and teaching how to process water and everything like that. None of that matters at all if you don't stay calm. They did a pretty good job at teaching us about staying calm in our hunter education course. So that was okay. But the reason I think it's because when you get out there and you find yourself in a survival situation, a real one, it's a heck of a lot scarier than most people think it's going to be. And I mean, I found myself in that situation, even walking on a compass bearing, and I'm bushwhacking, and the woods are really dense, and it's getting dark out, and thinking back to times where I didn't have an enormous amount of experience walking long distances through the bush on a compass bearing. When the bush is thick, you can't shoot landforms in the distance. You're just walking like this, trying to put one foot in front of the other so you don't drift off your bearing. And all of a sudden you start thinking, oh, I should have been there by now. I'm not there. Why am I not there? Maybe I went the wrong way. Maybe I drifted off my bearing. Jesus, is compass working? Are you sure it's the right way? Are you sure? All these things go through your mind. And your kind of thoughts can start racing. and you can literally walk across the trail that you were bushwhacking for without noticing it because you're all in a twither and you're not even thinking about things. There's been stories that I've heard about people that getting lost and think, oh, I got to get back. I need to get back to camp again. And being in this kind of state of mind, and they walk right past a cabin with firewood and the door wide open. And then they stop and, oh my God. And they turn back and they go in the cabin, they get warmed up, they get a fire going, they get something warm to drink. They spend the night there and they get back to their cabin the next day and they got turned around, but they were in no danger. But because they get fixated, because you get panicked, you really start to not think clearly. And so a lot of the time, people that know how to build a shelter, make a fire, get water, and potentially get food too, they don't even get to those points because they forget the first thing, which is stay calm, or they're unable to do that. And so I think one of the best ways that you can learn how to stay calm in a survival situation, or even not even necessarily survival situation, one that's starting to, you don't even need to be in a survival situation to start getting freaking concerned, okay? You can just be kind of heading for one. You can just get like turned around in the bush a little bit and start to panic, even though you're not even lost, and your kind of mind just start to race. Your mind starts to race a little bit, right? So I think the first thing that you want to do before heading out is just planning. Okay, if it's an area that you don't know very well, look at a map before you go out there. Just take a few minutes just to memorize a few things. Okay, I'm going into this area. Okay, there's a bush road to the east of me, roughly 2 miles away, we'll say. To the north, there's a hydro slash. To the east is a lake that I can pick up the shore and follow it back to where I started. As long as I don't walk due south, for example, I'll be okay. Or, due south a little further and I'll hit a highway. Then your only obstacle is making sure you don't walk in circles. And that's why a compass is so important. If you get lost and you really don't know where you are and you can't triangulate your position, having a compass just to make sure you can walk in a straight line, whether it be north, south, east, or west, knowing that you're going to hit something like a hydroslash can be all you need to survive. You don't have to have any fancy compass knowledge, fancy compass skills to do that. So remember, when it comes to getting lost, try to memorize some stuff, memorize some things in your location, landforms and stuff like that. Then when you start getting turned around, sit down, deep breathing, focus on your breathing and think, okay, to the north of me is a hydroslash. To the east of me is a bush road. To the west of me is a lake. If I hit any one of those things, I can follow them to the other and get back to where I'm going. And you just stop and you think rationally. You think the things you know. They think the things that you've planned before you started going out. Same thing happens in the seat of a canoe. I don't know if you've ever gotten lost in the seat of a canoe before. One time, my brother and I, we were in a fairly remote area of northern Ontario, and we were kind of having a chat, and we were following this island, and we were looking for an opening on the shore across from the island. Well, somehow we thought that the island, the gap between the island and the shore was the opening. And we ended up circumnavigating an island without knowing it. Pretty embarrassing. I think we drank too much coffee and we were like in a rant to talking about salmon or some interesting thing like that. And my brother's like, we went in a circle. And I'm like, no, we didn't. With that, that no, we didn't voice where you're just like, it's not very honest. You're like, you kind of think maybe we did. And he's like, yeah, look at that log. We just saw that log. And I turned over and sure enough, that was a log. It wasn't a big island. And then, what the heck's going on? It was very disorienting. But of course, we figured out what we did, how to laugh at it, and went on our way. Lakes with lots of islands and stuff like that, it can be very challenging. Anyway, so yeah, I think I've talked a little bit about here outdoor survival and how it relates to wilderness canoeing, which was kind of the topic of this. And I want to get into a little more on some of the more specifics of wilderness canoeing. Remote trip planning, choosing the right gear. I've already told some paddling stories. So if anybody has kind of a survival related question, a what if related question, I'll take a couple questions right now. And that way, if there's anything on your mind, and I won't only take questions at the end, so I'll maybe take like 3 or 4 questions right now. So if anyone has some questions, shoot. I'm going to just look at the iPad here. Any questions, Tori?
Yeah, I just pinned one.
Oh, okay, at the top. Okay, Richard West. How does adrenaline play into your survival situations when things go really scary? How does adrenaline play into your survival situations when things go really scary? Well, I suppose I've never really been in a true survival situation. Knock on wood. So alone was, we didn't know where we were. It had all those elements of being stranded, shipwrecked, all that, but there was a tap out button. So I guess, I suppose the blizzard story in the Arctic could come into into play here. The other story is when I was being stalked by a mountain lion, and I felt this intense adrenaline. So if that adrenaline, you gotta be able to use it, to essentially trigger a fight or flight reaction if you are faced by something like a mountain lion. And the worst thing you want to do is run when a mountain lion's stalking you. You got to make that cat think that you're not going to be something that's going to be easy to eat. And I remember I just had this rush of adrenaline come over me, and I grabbed my axe and I brandished my axe and I yelled at the thing, like wanted to fight it. And I think, it probably could have easily killed me, but it decided maybe I'm going to kill something that's not going to get like a really good blow with an axe in, because if you're a cougar living in the woods, one chop with an axe, even though you win the fight, could be a real problem for you. So in that aspect, I think that's good, fight or flight. But where it doesn't help is when you kind of start panicking, you get lost. Some of the stories I explained before, and you just stop thinking straight. And that's when you really have to sit down and you have to breathe deeply and you have to think rationally. Okay, this to the east of me, I know that there's a river. To the west of me, I know that there's a large lake. If I can walk east or west, I can then follow the large lake back to a road. You know what I mean? But you don't think those simple things that when you're in that panic situation. And honestly, I think that I would say that staying calm, which is supposed to come before shelter, fire, water, food. Staying calm is heavily overlooked, and that's all psychological. So it's going to be different for different people. But staying calm is potentially the hardest one. That's very challenging to just read up a step-by-step on how to do that. So learn how to stay calm. That's a great freaking survival tip for you. Okay, we'll do another question. How does one teach psychological resilience? How does one teach psychological resilience? And that's Wilderness Canoe Association. Thanks for joining in the chat. So I think that exactly, how does one teach? And that is the problem, because it's not something that you could learn on a YouTube video, that you could learn in a book. It's psychological resilience is only something that comes with experience, with true bush time most of the time. And I think it takes time. It's like a muscle. You have to build it a little bit. A lot of these, mental discipline, that's the same thing. It's like a muscle. You have to build it a bit. But I think the answer is by, a good way to start teaching psychological resilience is challenging people, getting people to challenge themselves, we'll say, into putting themselves into situations that are kind of hard and miserable, but that at first aren't going to present any real danger as long as they know how to light a fire. And maybe if they don't, maybe they have a way to contact the instructor who is close at hand. But that is something, because if it's raining and you can't, and you're in a situation where you need to get a fire going and you can't do it, that's a situation where people might panic. But if you have that psychological resilience, you know that you're going to be able to get that going and that you're going to be fine. You're going to be able to get warmed up. So yeah, I think the answer is putting yourself into more real situations bit by bit, and that way, you know, by the time you have some experience doing that, and how you know when you have this skill. Let's say you're in the bush, you're doing a portage, you're more experienced than your buddies. They're complaining, you're still having fun. Okay, so essentially, you know, that skill is not giving a SHIT or whatever, right? And not giving a SHIT comes with skill. I don't know if that gives you any ideas. I hope it does. I don't really know what the answer is there. Okay, we'll do another question. Camping. How many more days do you think you and Ted could have lasted on the show alone if you didn't win? How many more days could Ted and I have lasted on the show alone if we didn't win? So Ted and I said that we would leave at 90 days, no matter what. That was our cutoff point. We made it 75. 90 would have been pretty challenging to even make it. I like to think we could have done that. But I think, you know, for sure we would have had another 10 days in us. And I guess if you look at how much weight other contestants lost on other seasons, you know, we probably could have done 90 and we would have pushed through for 90. But at that point, we might have started doing serious damage to ourselves, to our organs, longer recovery time afterwards. At that point, it's just really not worth it anymore. And even 90 might have not been worth it. So the answer is, I guess, I don't know, but I think probably the answer is 90. We could have done 15 more days. Gee whiz. If you know absolutely nothing about survival or camping or navigation, etc., what's the fastest way to get up to, it's cut off, get up to speed? Classes, books, or videos? So what's the fastest way to learn about wilderness survival, camping, navigation, etc.? I like your style, gee whiz, because you want to learn it all. I like that. I'm the exact same way. So I think that, and being someone that didn't really do a great job at learning from books in school per se, when you're not in a class environment because there's no deadline, a book is the best teacher because it's always ready to teach when you're ready to learn. So when you want to learn, you pick that up and nobody's forcing you to learn. And of course, when we're in that mindset, we learn a lot better. So I learned a lot of things from books by picking up the books, almost not reading them, but studying them. One's called Expedition Canoeing by Cliff Jacobson. Now it's called Canoeing Wild Rivers by Cliff Jacobson. Another one is Path of the Paddle by Bill Mason. Paddle Your Own Canoe by Joni and Gary McGuffin. The Complete Wilderness Paddler is another one. Morse Kahansky Bushcraft. SAS Survival Guide. Those ones there are pretty good. If you get those ones, you're going to be good. And what I do, yeah, I go back and I study them, and I make notes and all that. But with the canoeing ones, these ones have photos that explain each photo, if something like a front ferry or a back ferry, right? And I think visualizing is very important. So you're not trying to get to the end of this book and bang it off. You're using it as a learning tool. And so you're seeing how to do a canoeing maneuver. The best thing you can do is close your eyes, imagine yourself in the canoe, imagine yourself in moving water, and visualize what the book's telling you a bunch of times in a row. Then you get out there and try it. That's completely how I learned everything to do with whitewater. I didn't start paddling whitewater until I was in my early 20s, and I learned it completely all from just visualizing photos from books. So I think that's great. Courses are great. I didn't take one, but I imagine that it would be good. You know, you can get out there and try learning things yourself, but then that works. However, sometimes you end up learning bad skills when it comes to, say, whitewater canoeing, for example, or you know, other things that kind of become a reflex that you have to just unlearn. So if you can get out there off the hop and learn, take a class from somebody that is better than you, that's probably the best way to go about it. There's courses at the Madawaska Canoe Center. There's you know, wilderness survival courses, of course. A great way if you're a beginner, check out at paddlelikeagirl.com. That's my wife Tori's business, and she runs workshops right off of our property here on the Magnetawan River that teach introductory canoeing and backcountry camping skills to women specifically, and you can also meet other people that might want to plan some trips with you, so check that out too. But yeah, I think all the above. I think just dive right in, become a sponge to learn as much about this stuff as you can. First thing you should do is watch all my YouTube videos and watch all the ads as well. Okay, when you axed your hand, how did you slow the bleeding? Okay, Deb Wilson, when I axed my hand, how did I slow the bleeding? So just to give a little context, I ended up with a pretty nasty injury on my hand when I was up north of Lake Superior, paddling the East Puckasaw River with my brother Ted a couple springs ago. And what happened was I had you know, not a razor sharp axe, but you know, sharp enough axe, and it had a sheath, the kind of sheath that the handle doesn't slide through. It only covers the bit, so the business end, the blade of the axe, and it's leather too. And there's a lot of rain, and so the leather got weak, and we were doing a bushwhack portage, and it popped off and fell off. Well, I was carrying it the way I do through the grab handles of my Eureka canoe pack, and I had the canoe pack, boom, on top of a food barrel. Well, I wanted to take a break, so I came up to just a rock ledge, like almost like a natural rock table, and I put one hand down, and I just pushed the canoe pack off the top. Well, I had something else jammed in there with the axe. I think it was a tripod, and so somehow that was holding the axe bit at a right angle, like this, and the sheath had fallen off. So somehow I pushed it off, and the axe blade came down with the whole weight of the bag, and just went boom, right on my hand, gashed it right open, right into the tendons. Fortunately, I don't think one of the tendons was cut at the time. I thought it was, but it was almost cut through, not completely. And so, you know, first aid's an important thing to do. Pressure. That's how I stopped the bleeding. To answer your question specifically, I put immediate pressure on the wound. It works really well. You don't put like a tourniquet. They don't even recommend pretty much doing that at all unless extremely serious situations. You put pressure on the wound directly. So I just leaned with all my weight, pressing as hard as I could for a very, very long time. And that's how the bleeding stopped. And we sealed it up. We used butterfly sutures and stopped the bleeding. The whole hand swole up, and we got out of the bush on something like an 8K bushwhack to a mining road. Then we then had to fall for another 4K to get out of there. So it was quite the adventure. Okay, I think I'm going to get on to talking about, or maybe we'll do one more question, Tor? Okay, I think we might do, well, if you don't have one, I'll just jump into the next section. Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to jump into the next section. And this one is going to be choosing the right gear. So we're going to be mostly focusing on remote canoe trips, and there's kind of some rules of thumb. My main rule of thumb that comes to when you're planning, when you're trying to find good gear. My main rule of thumb is if it looks like it might break, it's going to break. And unfortunately, this has proven itself to be true to me a bunch of times. And so now if I look at something, I look at a piece of gear and it looks like it's going to break, I'm like, this is going to break for sure, because It's just happened to me a bunch of times, and I know it does. And then sometimes it's not the end of the world. Sometimes you can improvise, and but the problem is that if you buy a cheap speaker, who cares if it breaks? This thing only costs $2. What's the big deal? Well, there's a real supply and demand issue when you're in the middle of the Northwest Territories, and whatever that thing is, let's say it's your cooking stove, your camp stove breaks, and you're in the tundra or alpine tundra, and there's no wood around. Maybe you're in, northern Scotland or something in the Highlands. There's no wood. I guess you can try to find little sticks. It's very hard to even boil water like that, right? So there's certain things that if you wind up in a pickle, you kind of get yourself in trouble. So we're going to start with your canoe. Okay, so when you're doing super remote trips where you're going to have river travel. And river travel, potentially whitewater, you're going to want to go with an expedition grade material. Royal X you can't buy anymore. You probably could buy used ones still, but they might be hard to find. And the new kind of standard for expedition grade canoe material is by Nova Craft Canoe, and it's called Tough Stuff, specifically Tough Stuff Expedition. So it's the expedition grade of Tough Stuff. Just Tough Stuff is a lighter version, still very tough. But the stuff that you want to be tackling challenging rapids in places like the Yukon with is called Tough Stuff Expedition. The other one out there is a plastic. It's much heavier, but there's trade-offs with both. Is called T4Max. So, I know there's Expedition Kevlar. Some people get more heavy-duty Kevlars and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it's the plastics, the T4Max, or the Tough Stuff Expedition that is definitely what people are recommended to take on a remote canoe expedition. And one of the most important things, especially late season trips or when you're getting into areas where it gets very cold at night, hypothermia is your biggest concern. So you really want to look at keeping your stuff dry. Keeping your stuff dry is pretty key. And so to do this in the best way possible, you want to start with a dry compression sack. And so that's not just a compression sack. A lot of people are really familiar with compression sacks, and that's one where it's a stuff sack. So say you stuff your sleeping bag in the stuff sack, and there's a little flap that goes over the top, and then a bunch of cinch straps all around, and you tighten that up, and you go around and you tighten it all up till it gets tight and small like that. Well, a dry compression sack is a compression sack that you stuff your sleeping bag in, then you roll the top up and clip it, then you flip the thing up and compress it. Okay, so that is technically like submersible. The only problem is they're expensive. They're pretty expensive, and they wear out pretty fast. So I definitely recommend to line your dry compression sack with a garbage bag, like a clear plastic garbage bag will do the trick. That'll really extend the life of your dry compression sack, because what happens is just the abrasion of stuffing your sleeping bag and pulling it out every day, it wears through the waterproofing on the side. Then on top of that, you want to get a good dry bag with backpack straps on it. Yeti makes some with good waterproof zippers, but the top loading ones that are the roll top, you can kind of stuff more in. You don't have to worry about a zipper potentially breaking when you're trying to jam more stuff in there. However, the zippered ones are super easy to access your stuff, so they're great too. But as your main dry bag for an extended trip, you want to get a large, maybe 115 liter, we'll say, roll top dry bag. I know, I think NRS makes them, Seal Line makes them, Eureka, I don't know if Eureka's still making them, and I think MEC makes them as well, Mountain Equipment Co-op. And then you put your dry compression sack in that bag. Now everything's double waterproof. But what I like to do, I like to take an extra step, especially for more remote trips where there's white water, cold temperatures, all that, because I don't ever want my sleeping bag to get wet no matter what. So what I do is I line my large dry bag. So I line it with, you can just use a carpenter's garbage bag or a contractor's bag and line it, put your dry compression sacks in there, and then tie it off. But those kind of wear out, they don't last long. So ideally you buy a bag liner from Recreational Barrel Works. You can buy a heavy duty bag liner, and that liner will essentially work to waterproof any gear in any backpack too. So you can take that out if you're doing a day trip or whatever. But I like to use them, and then that way all my stuff is triple waterproof. Everybody, when I was a kid, nobody had food barrels. I think Wally Shriver of Trailhead, he's a guy that used to paddle with Bill Mason, started experimenting with olive barrels, and it made straps for them, thought these things are great, eventually made them for the canoeing market. I remember the first time I saw one of those, I was probably like 18, and I was like, do people carry, because they were blue, and I'm like, are people carrying water in those things? Like, what the heck is that? And I didn't make, to me it was crazy, because like, when you eat more and more food, your bag compresses and it's smaller. So why would you want something that never gets smaller? Well, I learned that these things are just the best, and I know trappers that use them, all kinds of applications to use these food barrels, and you can get varying sizes of them. I use them from Recreational Barrel Works. And you want a really good pair of straps too. I like one that has a tump line. And you don't only have to carry food in there, but the reason they're great for food is because they are a bear deterrent. I hear some people say, because they do limit odor, and they're also hard to get into, especially if you put a little zip tie through the snap up ring at the top. And I've heard people say, oh, bears get into that if they want to, and I'm sure they do, some kinds not, but you're better off to protect your stuff from animals if you have a food barrel. I've heard good things about sacks too. I've never used one myself. I don't know if they're as big, but yeah, the good thing about food barrels too is they float. So you have something that is airtight, also great to bring on planes, etc. You have to put a little tab in to break the seal so it doesn't compress on a commercial flight. But you can fill it full of 80 pounds of food, and this thing will float no problem. And it'll take some beatings, protect you from animals. Great thing to use, okay, for sure. And as far as compasses, communication equipment, there's probably no excuse not to have some form of communication equipment on you. I've used to go the way of the satellite phones, which are still great, and sometimes I like to bring both, but it gets both that and a satellite texting device. But it can get expensive with the sat phone. Plus, a sat phone's typically so big that you're not going to keep it on your person at all times, right? So that's why I really like an InReach by Garmin. And actually, the Garmin 66i is both an InReach and a high-end handheld GPS. So you can really have both things in one here. You can have one device. You can send messages with a link of your exact location. It has an SOS button in case it hits the fan and in an emergency you hit that, send out for a rescue. And you can also navigate with a GPS. So that's a great thing to have. Of course, there's apps on your smartphone. A lot of people are just using smartphone apps now, downloading maps into it. Smartphones more breakable. Essentially, probably not as reliable as a good handheld GPS. But maybe bring your smartphone too as a backup. Not a bad idea. Absolutely not. So I would bring that. I bring an InReach, a sat messaging device for sure. And when it comes to tents too, tents I think are getting better. But I see some tents that are just like, I wonder how they're even being sold. And you can get a tent for cheap, but a lot of them, even these big tents, that it looks like, oh, this is a glamping tent. I remember I did a trip and somebody talked me into, we were doing car camping at the Bruce Peninsula, and we were going to do all these hikes and paddling, and then, oh, we're glamping or car camping, you should bring this big tent. Well, it's not very glamorous when you're sleeping in a puddle of freezing cold water all night, because the glamping tent doesn't keep water out. And I would rather have my small waterproof tent. So the way you can tell if a tent is going to be waterproof is does the fly come all the way to the ground on the outside? Some of them, the fly's right on the top. So the fly should come right to the ground. A lot of tents I'm seeing they're being sold with ground tarps, and like, so even the manufacturers don't know this, but probably the worst thing you can do is set a tarp up on the ground and then set your tent up on top of that tarp, because what happens is that somehow condensation of water, especially if the tarp comes from to the outside of the footprint of the tarp is bigger than the footprint of the tent, it just collects water and that water just pools underneath you and you get soaked. The way to do it is to put the tarp as a ground tarp inside the tent. And if you get one that's a little longer, so it comes up the ends a little bit, and so the bottoms of your sleeping bag don't push up against the tent and get wet, that's a great thing to do. Right now I'm using probably the second best, maybe tied for first, if not second best tent I've ever used, and it is an MSR Remote 3. It has carbon fiber poles. It's a really good mountaineering tent. And I think that's the key word there. If you're looking for a good tent that's going to keep you bone dry, that's going to stand up to hard, heavy winds, if you're doing like remote trips, remote wilderness trips, get a mountaineering tent. These are the tents that people use to like climb Mount Everest. They're wicked. The best one I got before I did a trip in the Arctic on the Cujo River, which is further north in the entire state of Alaska in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And it was the Sierra Design Stretch Dome 3 or Stretch Dome ST. Anything from that Sierra Designs Stretch Dome line was amazing, but for some reason Sierra Designs doesn't discontinue them and came up with new designs, and people weren't buying them because, I don't know, they're weird or something, they're different, and so you can't get them anymore. Bummer. So yeah, but mountaineering tent is the way to go, and learn how to set it up, learn how to, different ways to set up your tent. A great tarp too. Tarps are things that have really gotten better. Check out the tarps by DD Hammocks. Again, if you want to get a good tarp, people just bring those like Canadian Tire tarps. They're so bulky. They're loud, they're impossible to fold, you can't really stuff them, they're heavy, they work, but they're dumb, right? So check out a DD Hammocks. I'm not really specifically an ultralight guy. Ultralight stuff is good, it's typically not as durable, it's more high performance. There's definitely a time and a place where people like to do that. But when you're going on a remote wilderness trip, I don't think it's the time. I mean, like going light. Here's why a lot of people don't travel light, including myself. What I do sometimes, but including myself. First of all, I have all my camera equipment, but it's because of the time. Going ultralight is a privilege that you have if you have an extra bit of time to pare down your gear. But when you're in a rush, you're trying to camp for a trip. Bring. Where's this? It's in the truck. Let's go. You don't have time to just yes or no, and you know what I mean. So that's an important thing as well. But anyways, yeah, ultralight tarps can work for sure. But I really like the DD Hammocks one. They're not ultralight, but they are very light, thin. They have amazing tie-off loops. There's all kinds of awesome ways you can rig these tarps up. Get creative. Learn how to rig them up in different kind of spaces, environments. Can you just rig them up with trekking poles, paddles, trees? What if there's not enough trees, etc., etc.? Do you use guy lines, all this kind of stuff? So tarps are a good thing to use. I feel like there's more about gear here that I'm not covering. I'm sure there is, but I might just jump in just because of time. If there are a couple questions anybody has about gear, you can shoot those off and I can ask them. Is this a question about gear, hon?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. Dale Gee. Jim, on extended long canoe trips, how do you plan your food? Do you count calories, etc.? On extended long canoe trips, how do you plan your food? Do you count calories, etc.? Thanks. Yeah, I think that should count kind of under gear, right? Because it's sort of something you're bringing. So that's something I think that's come with a lot of like practice is that I pretty much can just pack for a month-long canoe trip and know that I have enough food. Typically, I'm also eating fish out there, which I've gotten to the point where, for the most part, I'm confident enough at fishing that I can rely on it to an extent, which comes with some research and making sure where I'm going has good fishing. And at that time of year, some places you go, there's a heat wave. When I was on the North French River, the fishing wasn't very good, so you got to be careful. But definitely calories is a very smart way to go. If you're doing a really tough trip, you're looking at 6,000 calories per person per day, right? And if you're doing, portaging, paddling long distances, all that kind of stuff. So that's a good standard to go by. Now, what I typically do is I use calories not to overcomplicate things, but I use calories to make my decisions easier. So when I'm in the store, do I buy these bars or these bars? Which one has more calories? These ones. So everything is calories. Do I buy this or this? Calories. Okay, one with more calories. The one with more calories always, gets the W and winds up in my cart. There's these GNC super high calorie protein bars that you can buy. They're expensive. They don't taste great. You have to chug water with them, but man, do they ever give you a kick. You can try some of the powders, like Mammoth weight gain powder, these super, super high calorie things that people that are juice bags that are just bodybuilders are taking, right? Those things work great when you're out there and you need that energy kick. So yeah, counting calories is super important. You can get it really down to science and make sure that each person has the right amount of calories per person per day. And 6,000, I think, if a really tough trip, is how much you're going to need. Doesn't mean you have to eat that much every day, but if you keep doing that work and day after day you're not getting your calories, you're going to start losing weight and muscle, and you can start getting weaker. So, okay, any more questions about gear at all? Okay, Nancy W. Why do you prefer water purification tablets over a water filter pump? Why do I prefer water purification tablets over a water filter pump? It's just ease and time with the pump. So I've had, pumps are still good. I used to use them all the time. I just found out that I was just always getting dehydrated. When I use water tabs, I don't get dehydrated, And I did get giardia once on the Nahanni River because our water pump broke. And albeit we were pumping right from the silty river, we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know how to use a pump properly, right? Now I wouldn't have made that problem, but in a silty river, you fill up a bucket, a collapsible bucket's great, or just a pot. You let it sit. You let the silt go to the bottom. Some rivers that are like the Mountain River and NWT, it's almost muddy. So if you take a coffee filter and you elastic it to the intake of your pump and you pump, that'll clean it out. I'm a really big fan of gravity filters for at camp. And now I'm using squeeze filters on the go. But the reason I got away from pump filters is they just get gummed up fast. They get, you're pumping, stuff always gets in there. Next thing you know, they work for a bit and not too long, they're leaking. It takes forever just to pump a liter. It's getting gummed up. You're on a trip. Now things are taking forever. You try to clean the filter off. It doesn't work that great. And they just don't have the lifespan and too finicky. So what I'm using lately is a Canoeing squeeze filter top and a Hydro Flask bottle. The Canoeing squeeze filter top is great, and it has the filter built into it. If you're doing a long trip, you might want to bring 2 or 3 of those tops. But the problem is that the squeeze bottle that the Canoeing comes with is see-through and not good. Oh, by the way, speaking of see-through, if you're ever going to get a day bag, see-through ones, a roll top day bag, see-through ones always don't last as long. They're nice because you can see your gear. But now what I'm using for my backpack for my day bag is a Yeti backpack. It's got a zipper like this all the way around. It's completely submersible. Then you can open it and you can see all your gear, so there's no searching for stuff at the bottom of your bag. Plus, I don't have to strap it to another pack to portage. I can just put that backpack on, portage the canoe, and the shoulder straps act as pads for my carrying yoke, so I don't even really need a yoke pad. And so yeah, Yeti Panga backpack is my new day bag. It's probably my favorite Yeti product. For sure. But anyways, yeah, so if you get the Catadon squeeze bottle itself, it breaks, it pops, it's not durable. What you do is you buy a Hydro Flask, flexible bottle, and that fits the Catadon squeeze top. So now you have something that's got a clip, you can clip something onto it, clip it to a pack, it's got a little loop on the Hydro Flask, throw it in the bottom of your canoe, fill up, squeeze, or use it to squeeze to fill up other water bottles. So that's what I do. So I find myself just using that most of the time. So most of the time it's squeeze. The press filters too, again, they're hard to do from a canoe. You got to get out, you got to put, it's just too hard, too much weight, again, getting dehydrated. So, again, I'm during the day, I'm running my squeeze filter and water tubs. Be careful that you don't buy the Catadon water tubs, although they're amazing. They taste better. They take 4 hours to work. 4 hours is a long time. I actually just wrote a whole article on this, ways to purify water, for Field and Stream magazine, if you want to check that out. Okay, I'll take another question about gear. The river paddlers. Say you're planning a 7-day wilderness trip. How many days worth of food do you bring? Say you're planning a 7-day wilderness trip. How many days worth of food do you bring? Well, it never honestly hurts to bring a little bit of extra food. Like, how hard is it just to whip in a little bit more pasta, right? That being said, if you're going to be eating fish out there, do you really want to be carrying around all this extra food that you don't need? So safe answer is bring, at least an extra meal per person, maybe, and some extra snacks. Doesn't have to be an extra meal, but, whip something else in there just for good measure. So in case you get weather down, in case you get windbound, you're crossing a big lake, you get windbound, which rule of thumb is if you're doing a big lake, plan 1 day in 4 for being windbound. That's the rule of thumb, and usually it averages out. Doesn't hurt to get to have a little bit of extra food in there, but typically I don't bring, I will bring a side, and I'll bring, if I'm doing a 7-day trip, I'll plan half the days I'll be eating fish for dinner, and that way if I eat fish every night for dinner, well, I'll have a little bit of extra food at the end. I always usually wind up with extra food typically. There's been times where I haven't, but typically I do. I hope that helps. It depends on where you're going and how good you know how to fish in rivers and stuff like that too. So it's hard to give a key answer, but safe answer: bring an extra meal for everybody and some extra high calorie snacks. Canoe Hound, hey Dennis. Question: does the weight of a Bluetti power bank offset its usefulness versus carrying extra batteries? So does the weight of carrying some portable power, I have a number of devices. I have a Bluetti EB3A. I have a larger Jackery, I forget what it's called, it's much bigger. You saw Ted bring it in northern Manitoba. What makes sense, carrying that or carrying more batteries? I mean, how long's the trip that you're doing, right? If you have extra batteries, how many cameras are you shooting with? So I guess the answer is it depends on your battery, depends on how much it's cost. I think a good thing to do, Dennis, is you can get those smaller power banks that you can charge GoPro batteries while you're on the go with. You can charge your smartphone, and good. I think for my camcorder, one battery is $250. For my Sony mirrorless, I think a battery is $250 to $300. So how many more batteries? So I would say the answer is yeah. For me, it is definitely makes sense to bring that, because I'm also charging drone batteries too. And then the beauty of it is I can also recharge that with the sun. I can recharge my portable power generator with the sun. So in case all my other batteries run out, or in case I somehow leave the thing on or the light turns on or something and I run out of batteries, well, I can pull out a solar panel, recharge the whole sucker, where you can't recharge individual camera batteries. But for most trips, unless you're doing really, heavy filming, or you're probably going to be okay to just bring a bunch of extra camera batteries. But at what point is that as heavy and costs more than just bringing a portable power bank that you could just plug anything into, right? So I guess it's tough to give an answer to everybody, but for the most part, I think a few smaller kind of anchor batteries and a few extra camera batteries should do the trick, and probably be lighter. If you start doing more advanced filming, or longer trips, you're going to want to get something better, or you just want something, the peace of mind to be able to charge. I mean, at the end of the day, it's heavier to carry around, but a portable power bank that you can charge with the sun is the cat's ass out there, right? So, end of the day, that's the story. Hope that helps, Dennis. Looking forward to seeing you next video. All right. Another question, Tor? No more gear questions, anybody? Okay. So we're gonna move. No more gear questions?
Maybe, let me check.
Oh, I can jump off to the next topic. Oh, I didn't talk. I didn't talk about lures. Yeah. So my tackle box situation, it really varies. What is your preferred fire starter lighting tool and materials to light? So yeah, fire starting gear is important. So honestly, my preferred fire starting is just like a Bic lighter. At the end of the day, they're cheap. They're waterproof. I mean, they hard to get them to work when they're wet. There are ways you can do it, but they dry, you can use it. Whereas like a Zippo, if you drop it in the water, it's pretty much pooch. But lighters can break. So if I was going into a real survival situation, a ferro rod can dunk in the water. It can be used right away. It can smash on a rock. It can drop, etc., etc., etc. It lasts. It can light way more fires than a Bic lighter. So a ferrocerium rod. The only problem is it's a lot harder to light fires with ferrocerium rods, especially when things are wet. So it's great to learn different ways to do that. Some people use a piece of birch bark and they'll scrape the birch bark into a little pile, and they'll light that pile of birch fluff. That works great. That doesn't work the best if it's wet. Probably fat wood shavings. If you can find a branch from like a dying or dead tree, break that branch off. Pull it out from the tree. If the tree's rotting, find a rotting tree, pull that branch out. You'll find very resin-soaked wood. You can shave that up. Bring some with you. You can buy fat wood. But probably the best thing is balsam fir sap. Balsam fir are conifers, and they have those little blisters on them, and those little blisters are full of highly flammable sap. And if you find some cedar bark fluff, so you find a cedar tree and you scrape the bark, you scrape it, and you find that you get this big thing of fluff. That can almost even take a spark, and it smolders. You take that cedar fluff, and then you go to the balsam fir tree and you cut the little blisters, and you scrape off the sap, the balsam sap, with your knife, and you wipe it on the cedar fluff. That's going to go up like that with one spark from your ferro rod. So yeah, I carry magnesium fire starter with a flint. I carry multiple Bic lighters. I carry a tinder, usually just like fire sticks. I carry waterproof matches in a waterproof case. And I carry a big ferro rod. Don't get one of those small crappy ones, get a big one. And I carry this all as along with other survival things, which is also an important piece of gear. to have is in a survival kit for my remote wilderness trips, particularly remote wilderness whitewater trips where you might get separated from your canoe if you dump. It's a great idea always to have key survival things, communications equipment on your body. So I have a belt knife, I have a multi-tool on, then I have my in a fanny pack, but you don't have to call it a fanny pack, you can call it a survival pack because it sounds cooler. I have that on too. I wear it backwards so it doesn't get in my way when I'm sitting. And I have my inReach satellite texting device, or my 66i, which is a GPS and an inReach satellite texting device. I have that in my pocket, tethered to my belt. So if I dump, I have an SOS button, I have a GPS, I have a satellite texting device, I have a compass, fishing equipment, snare wire, way to make fire, way to purify, carry water, and all that good stuff that you find in a survival kit. I could go on, but I carry that on my person, and that could really save your life for sure. What is your recommendation for a limb saw? So I don't really I think a limb saw, is that like a silky, or you just mean like any sort of bush saw? I don't know I'm not familiar with what a specific limb saw is. I mean, I've used the silky saws, and they're great for sure. They're thin, the steel's really good. The problem with it is that you really have to set the wood you're cutting up in kind of, I don't know if the word is an ergonomic way, and they only cut on the pole, but you can cut through thicker stuff with them. I just go with my like my Agawa saw, or one of those aircraft aluminum saws where you fold up, handle pops in like that, gets nice and tight, and you saw away. Just because they're easier, they're easier to sort of get in at odd angles and cut at weird angles with. Like you could hold one of those saws and cut like this, but with a silky, you can't do that. So it's just in general more versatile. You don't have to set up the wood you're cutting perfectly, but if everything's set up right, the silky is better, I would say, and you can cut through thicker stuff. But I don't need it. I don't know if that answers your question. All right. Oh man, we're flying through. It's already 8. We've already been doing this for an hour. Okay. Well, I'm gonna get into what else we got here. So we have choosing the right gear. We talked about that for a little bit. I'm just gonna have a detour by Muskoka Brewery. Hopefully, you don't detour too off topic. Detour is good. It's what they call session IPA. And usually session IPAs, they taste like an IPA, except they usually have lower alcohol content. So they're like a typical beer, but with an IPA, typical beer alcohol content, but IPA, yeah. So this is 4.3%. So to think that this is almost a light beer just blows my mind. It tastes like a regular IPA, but it's 4.3%. Good job, Muskoka Brewery. I don't know how you do it. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about remote trip planning. And so, all this stuff kind of ties together: wilderness canoeing, outdoor survival. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. And then I'm hoping that then we'll do some questions. And the questions don't have to be, in general, we'll try to keep them on topic, outdoors, outdoor survival, wilderness canoeing, but they don't have to be specifically about trip planning. So after I do this one, I'll just open up a Q&A, and I'll try to answer the questions quicker so I can get to as many questions as possible. But I think when it comes to trip planning, I think the hardest thing for people is, where do we go? You know what I mean? What route do we take? And I think that's where a lot of people kind of get stuck. I don't have the spots, right? So I think getting online everything's done online nowadays. You know, is a great way to do things. When you're wanting to get into it, you know, probably a great way to start is by going to an operating provincial or state park, or the equivalent to that, wherever part of the world you may live. Because typically, when you go to a place like the famous Algonquin Park, or you know, Adirondack State Park or something like that, things are set up for outdoor recreational activities. So you can go in there and you can say, I want to do a canoe trip or something. Now you have to plan these things in advance. When I started going to Algonquin, you could just walk in and be like, hey, I want to do a canoe trip, and they plan your route with you, and you could just book it all. Right now, that's harder to do in peak season, because they have the maps, they have everything kind of there. Usually there's canoe rental, gear rental places right in that area. Americans, there's a law in Canada where you have to pay to camp on Crown land. However, if you engage the services of an outfitter, you do not have to pay on Crown land. So I highly recommend going to an outfitter, renting the cheapest piece of gear. If you have all your gear, obviously you can go to an outfitter and rent something more. But if you just, you know, engage the services of an outfitter, rent or buy or whatever, I don't know, get a shuttle from them, you know, something that you need if you need it, or rent a tent or something, and then you won't have to pay. I think it's $10 per person. I might be wrong about that, but that's a good tip to have. But yeah, so you know, Algonquin Park will say, here's where the old growth forests are. Here's, you know, these old log cabins. Here's the canoe route. Here's the canoe the canoe routes map. The portages are marked. The portages are cleared. The campsites are all marked. The campsites are, for the most part, maintained. So that kind of lays things out for it. When you start getting into public land and crown land areas, it's a lot more fun. You need to look at, you know, Ontario Crown Land Atlas. A lot of the apps are great. iHunter app is a great one. I've been using that. That works, you know, in North America in general. You buy one for the States, buy one for Canada. That'll tell you what's private property, what's not. And you can get out there and kind of learn it for yourself. And that's sort of typically comes with more challenges and more know-how, because there's nobody that you know, that has your route in a log. There's no, you don't know. You might show up at a portage trail, hasn't been used for many years, and you're in a bushwhack and you can't even find the portage trail, and all these kind of things. So once you start getting into some more remote places that aren't part of a park system, or aren't part of a, you know, a maintained operating park system, you probably want to, they're probably not the first place to start most of the time. So yeah, I'd say learning where to go is the best thing. Then, you know, that your next thing is planning your route. So what's your route? Plan it, get the maps. There's places where you can get maps online right now and print them off. I bought like a laser jet printer. So it's amazing. I can print on special paper. I can print and I can waterproof my maps with Thompson's water seal and hang them to dry, so they have a good amount of waterproofing. With a regular, I guess, inkjet printer or whatever, that would all kind of smear if you were to paint it, or you have to be much more careful when you're painting it. And you can just buy topographic maps. You can look at the topographic map index and select off of that grid which ones you want. You can talk to World of Maps in Ottawa and Map Town in Calgary are my two go-to places to purchase maps from. Chris Marr at the Adventure Map Company also has some great maps, and Jeff's Map too has a lot of canoe route areas in Ontario, Canada mapped out. You can actually download Avenza and download all of Jeff's map into Avenza and use it, import it, download it into your phone, and use Jeff's map in the GPS of your smartphone. That's pretty key. So that's a good one. If for those of you that don't know about that, get on that one. Yeah, so I'd say you know, where you're going, what maps you're using. Then a lot of the time you're going to need a shuttle if you're like me. But if you're getting into rivers that you don't know how safe they are, you can't find anybody that's paddled them. Well, pretty much most navigable rivers. I'm not a big guy that just tries to find first descents necessarily, although I think that's cool. I also like to paddle rivers that have a human history. I mean, of course, there are no real first descents, but that have a somewhat of human history. That's cool, and that are beautiful. A lot of the rivers that are beautiful, that have good fishing, they're places that people have been going to as opposed to haven't. So, so as much as I like exploratory kind of trips too, I definitely don't mind doing trips that somebody else has done. Do I want to see someone around every corner? Of course not, right? So how do you tell the challenges of a river? Well, everything has online. There's always a trip report or something, it seems like nowadays, but you can actually use your topographic maps to grade the drop of a river. The steeper the river drops, the more challenging it is. If a river drops 50 feet in a mile, it's like pretty much a waterfall, and it was like, it's like an advanced level kayaking river, right? So you can deal with a drop of like 10 feet every mile or something like that, right? But what you do is you basically count the squares in the military grid on your map. In Canada, from side to side, they represent 1 kilometer. I think from corner to corner, they represent, I believe, 1.4 kilometers. So you you count all those up in a stretch of river that you want to paddle, and you want to see how challenging, how much current's going to be there. Will there be rapids? Because you can't always judge off of by what rapids are marked on a topographic map. And in the north, those were taken by aerial surveys in the 70s, right? Then you count all the contour lines across the river. I also like to just mark those when I'm marking my maps before my trip. Then you look at the contour interval and you look at how many feet each contour line represents. And then you add those up and divide it by the number of kilometers in that stretch of river, and that'll give you the average drop of that river, and that'll kind of conjure up a feeling for the character of that river and what it might look like when you go out there. If you want to make sure, if you're getting to some remote river, that it's actually paddleable. Another thing to look at is how big are the headwater lakes on said river. If a river has small headwater lakes and the river itself has a steep drop, chances are that's going to be a spring run river, and it's going to be too dry to paddle later in the season. So definitely important things to look at. But I think the biggest one is just the logistics, right? So when you're getting into these kind of remote wilderness trips, is what logistically makes the most sense, right? So, for example, the trip Ted and I did, and the reason that the logistics are challenging is because most wilderness, specifically wilderness river trips or these kind of adventures are point A to point B. They're typically not loop trips. So you have to figure out how to get to the starting point and how to get back to the starting point where you might have left your vehicle or your house by the end of the trip, when you get to the end of the trip. And oftentimes those two spots can be very, very far away from each other. There are quick, I forget where I read this, but it might have been Cliff Jacobson, but he said there are quick and expensive ways to deal with logistics, and there are long and inexpensive ways to deal with logistics, right? So you got to find out what works best in your budget. The fastest and most expensive way to do things is charter a float plane. And a lot of these places, realistically, there's a good chance you need a float plane charter, but not all the time. We did a trip in northern Quebec and Labrador that was one of the most remote hardcore trips I've ever done. We drove to we drove to Sept-Îles on the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. Then we drove north to Labrador City. Then we jumped on a train that took us to the what was an iron ore community of Shefferville. There's no connecting roads, but there are some roads just within the community. The only way in and out is by putting your vehicle on a train back to the main road system. It's a long train. Then we got dropped off at a lake, Lake Atacamagan, and we paddled to the George River via the DePaul. We went up the George, we crossed the Height of Land to paddle the Adlatok. We paddled to the Labrador coast, paddled to a community, picked up the ferry that drove us south into Lake Melville to Happy Valley Goose Bay, which connects the Trans-Labrador Highway via the Trans-Labrador Highway from Happy Valley Goose Bay back to Labrador City, where we left our truck and we paid someone, a car dealership, to allow us to park it there, right? So this all takes time, and you gotta give yourself a fair assessment of how many days each step of this will take. When Ted and I went up to northern Manitoba, we drove to Thompson, Manitoba. There's a floatplane base in Thompson. Now this is in northern Manitoba, it's a pretty remote community. You could drive there. I think it took us almost 4 days. But then when there's a floatplane base there, but they didn't have the floatplane to accommodate what we needed. We needed one where we could, that had the Transport Canada approved struts to be able to tie a canoe on it. But they did help us by providing us with a shuttle. So we got a drive up to Leaf Rapids on a very muddy road. So a guy drove us in our vehicle, dropped us off in Leaf Rapids. However, there's no floatplane base in Leaf Rapids. So we got somebody to fly from Snow Lake, meet us in Leaf Rapids, and then fly us, I think it was only 100 kilometers, up the Barrington River to our starting point, where we then went up the Barrington River, oh, Honey's upset, and crossed over the Height of Land into the South Seal, paddled to the Seal, paddled to Hudson Bay, got a boat pickup at the mouth of the Seal by Jack Batstone. He drove us back in the boat to Churchill, Manitoba, and then Churchill, Manitoba connects by train to Thompson, Manitoba. They built the train track in the 30s because they thought it was going to be a great way to export grain out of the prairies, but they kept taking it to the lakehead, and for what reason it just has been operating at a loss ever since. So that took a long time to figure out. A lot of, planes, trains, and automobiles. These are the ways to do things. So take some time. You can ask people, talk to other people that have done the trip. What's the best logistics? Get online. There'll be some suggestions. Find the names, find the numbers, get out the calendar, set some dates, be reasonable on the expectations of how long it will take between point A to point B, and always be ready for setbacks. In the north, time does not dictate your travel schedule. Safety and the weather dictates your travel schedule. Don't jump in the boat and paddle on the Beaufort Sea because you're worried you're going to miss your plane and die because of it. Just wait it out. In the north and these more remote places, they understand this. They're lenient about this, and but sometimes it could cause challenges. One time I was weathered in Pangnirtung, Nunavut on Baffin Island, and it's $350 a night for a hotel room. Everything's expensive in the north, and $350 a night for a hotel room that doesn't even have a washroom in it, let alone a more expensive room. And I'm weather bound for multiple days. I think I ended up just camping in a field because it was just getting too expensive. Have a little bit of extra budget in case something like that happens. Same thing, we almost couldn't make it from the mouth of the Seal back to Churchill. If the weather had been bad, you could be in a situation where you might have to wait multiple days there for the weather to break until the boat can come get you, right? So do you have enough food? Do you have, always a good idea to bring some fishing stuff, bring a little snare wire in case you need to kind of get food, extra water purification tabs. Plan for the worst and hope for the best, I think, is the best motto to go by. Anyways, I've been going here for about an hour and 20. I don't know if I covered everything. I could have probably gone into more detail, but we want to have some time for another Q&A. So if anybody has any questions at all about trip planning, outdoor survival, wilderness canoeing gear, or anything related to that, let me know. Oh, I got one already here. Cobwebs World. We only get 4 episodes of the Nat Geo show. Was there more? So, yeah, the Nat Geo show Home in the Wild already ran on the US. It's running in Canada. I believe they're running episode 3 today. There are only 4 episodes. We only shot 4 episodes, and it's so far. It's looking like there's nothing yet. If enough people like the show, they're going to shoot more. We don't know for sure if we're going to get more episodes now. It's just going to depend on what the viewership is, how well it does, what budgets are, and a lot of other things out of our hand. But the show's been doing really, really well. So likely they're going to come back this year, if not early next, and shoot a lot more episodes. So if you like these and enough people like them, you're going to start seeing a lot more, and you're going to get to basically come along and watch the family grow, watch the kids grow, watch us, become more at home in the wild, watch us buy land, build a home in the wild. All of these things that we're talking about. In fact, a lot of things have been going on since we shot that show, and there's going to be a lot of exciting stuff that they're missing. So I hope they get back here soon. But yeah, write them a letter. Say, hey, I want to see more Home in the Wild. But yeah, unfortunately, only 4 episodes. Thanks for asking. Jonathan Mersill. I feel like Jim's use of a bent shaft paddle is somewhat rare in Canada. What are your go-to paddles for remote river trip? 1 flat water paddle and 1 white water paddle. Thoughts on double blades? Yeah, I guess I haven't used a bent shaft paddle in a while. I have seen a fair amount of like wooden bent shaft paddles here, but just so there's no confusion, a lot of kayakers think a bent shaft is where the shaft is bent. What canoeists mean by bent shaft is an offset blade. So it's the shaft is crooked at the bottom like that, and I actually found, so I have a Warner Algonquin and another one that's similar to that, and I did use them. I haven't used them for a bit, but I did use them on some trips, and I did actually paddle some whitewater. I mean, I think I soloed Allen's Rapids on the Nipissing River with them and a couple other rapids. When you're soloing and you have to J-stroke more, maybe they're not the best, but for a bow paddler, when you're tandeming, they definitely make your life easier because you're lifting less water up. So I think they do have their place. Yeah, maybe they are more rare in Canada. I don't paddle in the States very much, so I don't really know that. What my go-to are now is I'm using a new whitewater paddle by H2O. It's made of carbon. It's called, I think, the C1. And it's got a wider blade, so I think it's technically a little more made more for rafting, just because the blade's a little wider, which I like. But I mean, what's the big difference between a raft paddle and a canoe paddle? So it's a single blade. They also make a C2 canoeing specific whitewater paddle, which is great. I was using the Gray Owl Hammerhead, which is a wooden whitewater paddle, which I really liked. But then I got into my Warner Journey, which I used for several years, and it's as much as I love the nostalgia of the wood, it's just better. It's got the scoop blade. It's lighter. I can just paddle more intense rapids with it, And now I jumped into this H2O one just to try something else different. I also like the T-grip better than the Warner, and I like the wider blade better than the Warner. I think maybe the Warner Bandit with a fiberglass blade might be a little stronger just for pushing off rocks, so I haven't given the H2O one a ton of. I did a pretty intense. I just got off a pretty intense trip with it, but I like that. So what I'm carrying now is, and what I have been doing for a while, instead of taking a bent shaft. So some people will say, like Cliff Jacobson says, take a whitewater paddle, take a bent shaft, which probably isn't a bad idea because the bent shaft is decent in rapids, which a lot of people don't realize. However, I like to take a secondary paddle, aka my flat water paddle, I should say, I like to take something that could double in rapids should I lose my whitewater paddle. That's why I'm a little more precarious, let's say, to run rapids if my backup paddle is an otter tail, if my flat water paddle is an otter tail, because that's not going to be able to do much for me in whitewater rapids. So right now, what I'm bringing on my wilderness whitewater trips is I'm bringing my my C1 whitewater paddle by H2O Performance Paddles, and I'm bringing my Warner Journey. And the Journey I typically use is in fiberglass, and just because it's more durable for wilderness trips. The H2O carbon fiber paddle I'm using is super tough. The shaft itself is carbon fiber, not the blade. So I'm not worried about it breaking. If it was a carbon fiber blade, I wouldn't bring it on a remote wilderness trip. So that's where to go. I use double blades, sparingly. Like, you'll never see me use one on a solo trip. My brother's always like, "Why aren't we using double blades? I don't get it. It just makes so much sense." And like, a couple times he like duct taped like two single blades together. It's like, look at how much faster this is. And it's sort of like, why play ice hockey if you could play ringette? It's so much easier to stick handle. You know what I mean? It's a different sport. And we took double blades on our Manitoba trip, because we were doing some big lakes. Ted and I were soloing, and we're trying to keep pace with a trip report we read from, I think, the 80s, where these guys paddled tandem. So we thought with these massive lakes and trying to keep pace with guys paddling tandem, we should bring double blades. And we were right, we should have brought them. However, we were able to keep pace. They are faster. They are safer. It's undeniably safer if you're in big waves and on a big lake. You can fight the wind much better. You can paddle upstream much better. On this trip in Manitoba, we had to travel upstream. We had to paddle into winds. We had to deal with waves. You have something on either side to brace, and it was fun. It didn't feel like canoeing. You got this big thing. It's moving all around. It's splashing all over the place. Harder to sneak up on something. Harder to see wildlife because this big paddle's moving everywhere. But it was fun. When we got out there, we paddled some waves. We were going with the waves. It felt like I was kayaking. It felt like kind of like a different sport, but it was freaking fun once I got into the double blading. So I think they make sense. And now a lot of people bring double blades. Cliff Jacobson was a proponent of them. I keep bringing up Cliff because he's a guy I learned a lot from his books. He's a proponent of them, but he warned people that be careful because you're going to get made fun of for bringing these. So yeah, to each his own. I find when I go on trips with other guys that double blade, I'll bring one. But the other time I did a trip where we brought double blades, but one guy didn't get the note. Well, what's the point of bringing one? I almost just left it on shore because, I might as well just paddle with a single blade rather than the double blade and have to keep waiting up for the other guy, right? So yeah, I guess that's all I got to say about that. I don't typically bring them on solo trips, but they definitely make sense and are practical. Deb Wilson, waterfall. Is it safe to drink? What does that mean, Tori?
Water from a waterfall.
Oh, waterfall. Oh, waterfall water. Is it safe to drink? Sorry, apparently I can't read all of a sudden, Deb. I apologize. Is waterfall water safe to drink? I mean, yeah, why not? I mean, it's a waterfall water, I guess, is the same as any water, but you still would have to treat it. I think where people think it's better to drink water that's moving than stagnant water. However, you're better to drink water from out in the middle of a lake than you are moving water, because it's typically the Giardia parasite that can get you sick. It can give you beaver fever, and it's actually somewhat heavy. So in your middle of the lake, it will sink lower. You take the water from the top, you'll be okay. If the water's moving, like in a river, it might churn those parasites up. They don't get a chance to settle. If the water's completely stagnant, like in a beaver swamp, there's going to be all kinds of bacteria, probably Giardia in there too. So if you you're better off to take it from where it's flowing out of the beaver swamp than in the stagnant water. Absolutely. Waterfall water is no safer to drink, I guess, than typically river water. I think is the answer there. Thanks for the question. Kevin Packer, have you ever thought of snowmobiling or walking? Is route balance on the lower north shore of the St. Lawrence? It's a trail that connects Natashquan to Blanc Sablon. Route Blanchet. Sorry. La Route Blanchet. That sounds super fun, Kevin. Have you ever thought of snowmobiling or walking La Route Blanchet? So I've never heard of La Route Blanchet before. Lower north shore of the St. Lawrence, it connects Natashquan to Blanc Sablon. So I guess it essentially it goes on the frozen water, or does it go over land and then connect over the frozen rivers? I'd have to check that out. Never heard of it, but I'll put it on my radar. Good question. So I guess to answer your question, have you ever thought of snowmobile or walking La Route Blanchet? The answer is no, not until now. Sounds fun. Is that it, Tor? Oh.
There's a couple more.
CL. What is the best water filtration system? I don't really know. I hear Sawyer makes a good squeeze. I really like the squeeze stuff, but I'm going to say a good gravity filter, because that's something that you can use at camp, and then you can just keep water on hand at camp. The best ones are ones that you filter from one bag. It passes through the filter with gravity into a second bag. When the second bag's full, you then hang that bag up, and it's got a hose coming out of it, which you can turn on and off with a little clamp. So you need fresh water, you turn it on, you fill up your water bottle, you fill up this, you add water to this, you turn it off. Next day, you fill up all your water bottles before you head off, and you have nice, fresh filtered water. It doesn't really make sense to use when you're en route, because unless you want to pull over, maybe if you're having lunch, if you do that. I don't typically stop and dig out gear and stuff at lunch. I kind of eat more on the go. I'm going to say I'm a big fan of, I guess, some MSR stuff. I think I forget what it is. It might be the MSR Guardian, and then there's another one that can work in winter. Now you got to be careful with water filters, because when they freeze, when it's cold out, they don't work. And even if they're wet and they freeze, you can damage the filter in them. So I think it's called the MSR Guardian. Is the only gravity filter that can work in the winter. However, it's quite a lot more expensive, and also it's very slow. So it's not a good one that would double in the summer. If you're considering late season trips of any kind, I'd say check out, make sure that whatever filter you're using can handle the cold. I've been going with MSR. I've been liking those. So I don't have a ton of experience with other brands, but they work pretty well. And so gravity filters and squeeze filters. Gravity filters for at camp, squeeze filters for on the go. Those are my favorite types in general. I'm not sure the brands. I explained I really like the Catadine squeeze top with a Hydro Flask bottle, and the MSR. I think it's called the Auto Flow, is the one that will work in the summer, and then the Guardian I think only is the only kind that will also work in the winter. So those are the kinds I use. I've had good luck with them. Thoughts on life jackets? Astral brand, any good? I don't have any any experience with Astral brand. I don't even know if I've heard of them, to be honest with you. I thought I've heard of every outdoor gear brand. So I couldn't comment to that specifically. But yeah, I think it's important to just have something that you feel comfortable that you can move in. I think it's also important to have a life jacket knife. I've never had to pull mine out and use it, but you keep that life jacket knife, you keep it sharp, you don't use it for anything else, and you keep it on you. I know somebody else that has had to use it. So get a good jacket knife and make sure you have a life jacket where the knife can attach to it in such a way that, let's say it's here and let's say you're paddling left, well, the top of that knife sheath doesn't keep poking you in the bicep or vice versa. So make sure that it sits on the life jacket in a way that isn't uncomfortable. I was using the Kokatat Ronin Pro for a long time. Now I'm using a different Kokatat one, which is really cool. It's got a ton of zippers in it, which I really like. The only thing I don't like about it is that you have to kind of put the straps over your head to put it on. With a Ronin Pro, you could just throw on like this and it stays open in the front. So that made it easier to get on and off for me. I forget what the one I'm using now is called. But yeah, I haven't really used much. Cialis, or Cialis. Never mind. Yeah, is a good one. Salis Marine is one. My dog has a Salis Marine one. But yeah, I've just been using Kokatat, so I can't, to be honest with you, I know Helly Hansen came out with some lower end paddling jackets, but to be honest with you, I don't have much more experience other than with Kokatat because they're just great, and it's literally what I've been using since 2008 for my paddling life jackets, PFDs. In the outside question, what do you consider more important to consider packaging dehydrating for extended trip if you aren't sure of the fishing? Protein versus calorie. Yeah, like, I don't know. I dehydrate. I've been dehydrating a good amount of food. I've been making pemmican. You can make it with just like tallow, render tallow, or with lard with tender flake. I think just calories is important, versus protein. I mean, protein's important too, but remember, you can't digest protein without fat, right? So you got to make sure that you have fat. You got to make sure that you have carbs, or else protein in and of itself isn't going to do much. Also, regardless, we can only digest so much protein each day. So there's no point in eating over, I don't know what the number is, a specific amount of protein, because you're just going to crap it out anyways. So I'm not really sure what the answer to that is, protein versus calories. I would definitely lean on the side of calories, but like, are you just going to be pounding Mars bars out there? That's probably not the best idea either. So you do need protein. But I would say, yeah, you need protein, but lean more heavily on calorie specific stuff, not empty calories. That's the best I can answer that. Craig, how are you finding the Supernova in comparison to your usual prospector? I have a Prospector 16 that I tandem, but it's big, it's a bit long term for solo whitewater, I think. Yeah, so I just did my second trip with the Supernova on Tuesday. I absolutely love it. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but if you already are a decent whitewater paddler and you know how to brace, I've heard some people say that it's tippy. When it's loaded, it doesn't feel tippy, but when it's empty, you're sitting up in it. Some people can say, I've said it's tippy. I haven't really found that to be the case to a large extent. It's if you travel, it's going to be harder for room for your dog if you like to travel with your dog. Plus, if your dog's standing up on gear, up on a spray deck, that could make it tippier. That's one drawback. I solo a 15-foot prospector, and the comparison between it and the Supernova is like night and day. In fact, I'm noticing sometimes that with the Supernova, it turns so quickly. Supernova's 1410. It just feels significantly shorter than the 15-foot prospector. Plus, it's more narrow. It's not such a heavy volume boat. It just turns on a dime. And you start to run things and you think, well, this boat seems so much littler than my other boat. Is it going to be able to take these huge waves? And then it does, or you just dodge the waves and you just miss everything. Lines that you couldn't hit at all in a 15-foot prospector. You're just nailing in the Supernova. And in fact, it takes some getting used to because it turns so fast. I'm used to putting in so much energy to turn a loaded prospector, like a 15-foot prospector, that all of a sudden I'm overcompensating and I'm turning too much. And I have to, I gotta go back the other way. So yeah, if you're looking for a solo whitewater boat, and you have some whitewater paddling experience, if not, you can get used to it. But I mean, what else are you gonna get? Would you get a 15-foot prospector? It's so similar to your 16. You know, you might as well just solo the 16 if you're doing a longer trip without as intense whitewater, and just bring the Supernova for, your more whitewater specific solo trips. Probably the best way to go in your situation. But yeah, for some of my longer trips where I have flat water, where I'm taking the dog, where I'm taking like that trip I did in northern Manitoba, it's a month-long trip. That's definitely a trip where I would gonna want to solo my 15-foot prospector. The North French River trip I did, the Kasagami, I'd consider taking the Supernova for those. I know a guy who did the North French in the Supernova. I'd consider doing the Kasagami in a Supernova for sure, especially if I was going to fly into Kasagami Lake and get picked up on James Bay by a boat. But yeah, Prospector is just more versatile, holds more gear. So, there's always trade-offs, but if you're looking for a solo whitewater boat that you can still do up to a 2-week trip in, man, I don't think there's any better possibilities around. Especially you can get them in Tough Stuff Expedition, of course, too. So they're the lightest solo whitewater boats around. So yeah, I think that's the best way to go. Ross Bisson, which dry suit or rain gear do you think is best for newcomers to canoeing? So a dry suit, just so we're not, just so I'm on the right track. A dry suit is like, it's got gaskets at the wrist, it's got either gaskets at the ankles or paddle socks, or like built-in Gore-Tex socks. I don't recommend getting one with ankle gaskets. Get one with built-in Gore-Tex socks so your feet don't get wet. And it's got a net gasket. I think what you would need, if you're going to start doing whitewater when the water's cold, you definitely want a dry suit. I used to just do it with wetsuits. You can use a wetsuit too. It's just not as comfortable, and the neoprene was kind of agitating my skin, and it's a lot colder when you dump at first too, so it amps up the stakes for sure. But I think what you kind of need probably is a rain jacket and a dry suit, and you don't need rain pants if you're doing, whitewater trips when the water's hypothermatic cold. That way you can wear the dry suit bottoms as your rain pants. Sometimes when you're not paddling rapids, you don't want to keep your full dry suit on because it can kind of choke your neck a bit. I like to take the top off, tie the arms up around my waist, and then I can just wear those at camp as my rain pants and wear my rain jacket on top of that. I often bring rain pants too, just in case I don't want to wear my dry suit bottoms and I want to throw on rain pants when I'm not dry. I basically never wear them. I guess the question is, if you're doing whitewater trips with cold water, you're going to want to bring a dry suit, in which case you're probably going to need to bring a rain jacket too. That also has a hood So I would go dry suit and rain jacket. If you're not doing any whitewater, well, just bring rain jacket and rain pants, and that should do it. And you don't need a dry suit. So hope that helps. Okay. Well, it looks like, oh, here we go. Nate Muskoka. Hey, this is my buddy Nate Muskoka. Follow at Nate Muskoka on Instagram. Would you rather wander around a campsite in dry, thick socks or wet, soggy Under Armour sneakers? Would I rather wander around a campsite in dry, thick socks or wet, soggy Under Armour sneakers? I mean, I'm gonna go. I mean, like wandering around in dry, thick socks, they're probably just gonna get wet if you're wandering around a campsite and you're not wearing shoes anyway. So they're probably gonna get wet, or you're gonna hurt your tootsies, or like So in theory, I think I'd rather wear the socks, but they're just gonna get dirty. It seems weird. So probably safety wise, I'd probably wear the Under Armour, the wet Under Armour sneakers. Best question of the night, Nate. Thanks a lot. Okay. All right, are we all done, hon? Okay, thank you very much, Roy Mack. Appreciate the donation. Okay, well that winds it up, and it is 8:51, so we went over here a good bit. I hope everybody enjoyed this chat. I'm hoping to be back on the I don't think I'll be here last Thursday of July, but I'm hoping to get continue doing about one of these chats per month. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already, Jim Baird Adventurer, and you can check me out on Facebook, Jim Baird Adventurer. I'll let you know when I'm doing more live chats, as well as Instagram at JB Adventure. And make sure in 10 minutes, if you're in Canada, you turn on Nat Geo TV and watch episode 3 of Home in the Wild. Some pretty exciting stuff is about to go down. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and really appreciate all your support. Wish I could get to more questions, and I promise, you know what, the next chat I do, I'll just do Q&A the whole time, and I'll get to everyone's questions. How about that? So stick around for that. Thanks again. Have an awesome evening.